It happened in minutes. A social media post went up. The leader of the most powerful nation on earth typed three words that the entire world stopped to read: immediate ceasefire now. He said both sides were looking for peace. He said final negotiations were moving forward. He said things should move quickly. And then, less than minutes later, Iran responded, not with a press conference, not with a diplomatic statement through a neutral country, with a military announcement. Iran's armed forces declared they were halting their offensive against Israel. The world exhaled, and then Israel struck Lebanon again, and the world held its breath once more, because what looked like a ceasefire was not really a ceasefire. What looked like progress was not really progress, and what looked like the most powerful man in the world calling the shots was actually a man scrambling to hold together a deal that his closest ally was actively trying to destroy. This is the story of June 8th, 2026, the day the Middle East came within hours of a catastrophe that would have made everything that came before it look small. Stay with me, because there are layers to this story that most people do not understand, and those layers determine whether the world has peace in the next 90 days or something far worse. To understand what happened on June 8th, you need to understand everything that came before it. Go back to the spring. The United States had just finished a war against Iran, not a small conflict, not a few airstrikes, a real war, missiles falling on Israeli cities, American forces striking nuclear facilities deep inside Iranian territory, the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow waterway through which 20% of the world's oil passes, under the control of Iranian military forces who were deciding day by day which ships were allowed through and which were not, oil prices above $90 a barrel, global shipping routes disrupted, economies rattled from Europe to East Asia, and then on April 8th, a ceasefire was announced. Pakistan brokered it. 2 weeks of pause, conditional on Iran reopening the Strait of Hormuz to commercial shipping. A fragile, temporary truce that both sides described very differently. Washington called it the beginning of peace. Tehran called it a pause, while reserving the right to resume at any time. The gap between those two descriptions was enormous, and into that gap, a negotiation began. For 2 months, teams from both countries met through intermediaries. Pakistan played the mediating role. The agenda was complicated beyond what any headline could capture. Issue 1, the Strait of Hormuz. Who controls it? Under what conditions ships can pass? How the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's grip on that waterway gets loosened. Issue 2, Iran's nuclear program. Washington wanted guarantees. Tehran wanted to keep leverage. The distance between those two positions was not small. Issue 3, money. Iran wanted sanctions relief. Iran wanted reconstruction funds. Iran wanted guarantees up front, not promises contingent on future behavior. And issue 4, the one nobody in Washington wanted to talk about publicly, Israel. Because Israel had never agreed to this ceasefire. Israel had never formally endorsed these negotiations. And Israel had a very different view of what an acceptable outcome looked like. A senior regional diplomat told observers quietly that meaningful negotiations had actually regressed in the days before June 8th. The sequencing of Hormuz reopening was unresolved. The nuclear demands were unresolved. The money question was unresolved. But Washington kept saying publicly that things were moving forward. And then the weekend of June 7th arrived. Israel made a decision. The Israeli military launched strikes on the southern outskirts of Beirut, the Dahiyeh district, a longtime stronghold of Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed militant group that Israel has been fighting in Lebanon for months. This was not a small development. The American president had been pressuring the Israeli prime minister explicitly to stop attacking Lebanon. The reason was simple. Iran had made clear from the beginning that any ceasefire arrangement with Washington was conditional on all fronts going quiet, not just the direct Iran-Israel conflict, Lebanon too, because Hezbollah is Iran's partner, and Iran was not going to sign a deal while its partner was being bombed. The American president reportedly called the Israeli prime minister the previous week and used language so direct, so profane in its expression of frustration that it leaked into the press immediately. He told the Israeli prime minister to stop, that they were close to something good, That reckless military action was going to blow up months of delicate diplomacy. The Israeli prime minister launched the Lebanon strikes anyway. Tehran's response was immediate and overwhelming. Iran fired salvos of ballistic missiles toward Israeli territory. Israeli air defense systems activated across the country. Sirens went off in cities. People ran for shelters. A missile wreckage was found near a city in the West Bank. The Houthi movement in Yemen, aligned with Tehran, simultaneously announced it would block Israeli maritime navigation in the Red Sea. They claimed responsibility for a separate missile launch toward Israel, the first such attack since the ceasefire. In a matter of hours, 3 separate military fronts reignited simultaneously. Iran direct, Lebanon via Hezbollah, Yemen via the Houthi movement. Everything that the ceasefire had paused was back all at once. Oil prices jumped nearly 5% overnight. Brent crude climbed back above $97 a barrel. Global markets reacted. Airlines rerouted flights. Shipping companies suspended Red Sea transits. The 2 months of fragile calm evaporated in a single evening. That is the moment the American president posted on social media early Monday morning, June 8th. He wrote that both sides were looking to do an immediate ceasefire, that final negotiations on peace were proceeding. He added a qualifier, subject to ignorance or stupidity getting in its way. He said the blockade on Iranian ports would remain until a final deal was reached. He said things should move quickly. Read that carefully. He did not say the ceasefire was agreed. He did not say it was in effect. He said both sides were looking to do it. He said negotiations were proceeding. In diplomatic language, that is not a confirmation of anything. That is a statement of aspiration dressed up as a statement of fact. But here is what that post accomplished. It gave Iran a face-saving way to step back. Iran's military, minutes later, issued its own statement through its Central Military Command. The cessation of armed forces operations is announced, but, and this is the part that matters most, the statement immediately followed that announcement with a warning so direct it erased any illusion of peace. If aggression and acts of malice continue, including in southern Lebanon, much more severe and crushing measures than before will be forthcoming. Not just harsher, much more severe, much more crushing than before. Than before meant than the missile salvos that just set off air raid sirens across an entire country. This was not a ceasefire announcement. This was a conditional pause with a loaded gun pointed at the trigger. And then Israel struck Lebanon again, less than an hour after Iran announced its suspension of operations. The Israeli military struck southern Lebanon. The Israeli prime minister released a video statement saying Israel had halted attacks on Iran, stopping short of acknowledging any ceasefire, not using that word, not accepting that framing. And the Israeli defense minister stated separately that troops would continue to operate in Lebanon against Hezbollah. Let that sink in. Iran said, we stop if Lebanon stops. Israel said, we stop attacking Iran, but Lebanon continues. This is not a ceasefire. This is 2 sides talking past each other while missiles and artillery continue to fall on a third country. And the American president, watching all of this from his golf club in New Jersey, had already publicly declared that both sides were looking to do an immediate ceasefire. He was wrong, or he was describing a world that did not yet exist, or he was trying to speak it into existence through the sheer force of public declaration. Here's the piece of this story that requires the most careful attention. The American president and the Israeli prime minister are not aligned. That sentence alone would have been unthinkable in American politics even 2 years ago. The relationship between Washington and Tel Aviv has been called the closest alliance in American foreign policy. Unconditional, unbreakable, non-negotiable. But on June 8th, 2026, the American president told a major publication directly that the Israeli prime minister would have no choice but to accept whatever deal Washington negotiated with Iran. He said, I call the shots. I call all the shots. He does not call the shots. That is an extraordinary statement. A sitting American president publicly overruling his closest ally, publicly stating that the Israeli prime minister's military decisions are subordinate to Washington's diplomatic priorities. And the Israeli prime minister's response was to bomb Lebanon again within the same news cycle. This is not a small crack in the alliance. This is a visible public rupture at the highest level, the kind of rupture that other powers watch very carefully. Because when Washington's closest ally openly defies Washington's direct instructions, it tells every other country in the world something important about the limits of American power. Now let us talk about the deal itself, because understanding what is actually being negotiated explains everything about why this conflict keeps reigniting. The core issue is the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. It is approximately 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, and through it passes roughly 20% of the world's traded oil, 1/5 of global petroleum supply. Every day, Iran sits on the northern shore of this strait, and since the conflict began, Iranian forces have exercised de facto control over who passes through and under what conditions. This is not a theoretical threat to the global economy. It is a real, active, daily reality that has already driven oil prices to levels not seen in years and disrupted supply chains across the industrialized world. Washington wants the strait open, unconditionally, for all ships, without Iranian Revolutionary Guard forces deciding who passes. Tehran sees the strait as its ultimate leverage, its insurance policy, the one card that guarantees Washington cannot simply walk away from the negotiating table. A diplomat with knowledge of the talks noted that 3 issues remain completely unresolved just days before the June 8th escalation: the sequence of reopening, who moves first, Iran opening the strait or Washington lifting sanctions. Neither side trusts the other to follow through if they go first. The nuclear question. Washington's position is that Iran cannot be permitted to develop or acquire a nuclear weapon under any circumstances. Tehran's position is that its nuclear program is a sovereign right and a deterrent against the kind of attack it already experienced. And money. Iran wants sanctions relief and reconstruction funds up front. Washington wants compliance first and payment after. These two positions are not close to each other. Meanwhile, another layer of complexity sits underneath all of this. Iranian negotiators have told American counterparts through intermediaries that they have no problem moving forward with talks, as long as they are confident the American side is being honest and sincere. That phrase, honest and sincere, coming from a government that just watched its military announcement get ignored within the hour by continued strikes on Lebanon. Their confidence in Washington's ability to control its own ally is at this moment approximately zero. There are 3 possible trajectories from here, and all 3 have very different consequences for the world. The first trajectory, the ceasefire holds and negotiations accelerate. In this scenario, the events of June 8th function as a controlled explosion, a release of pressure that actually clears the air. Both sides pulled back from the worst escalation in months. The American president's social media post gave Iran a public framework to de-escalate without appearing to surrender. And the Israeli military, despite attacking Lebanon again, ultimately held off from further direct strikes on Iranian territory after the president's personal intervention. In this scenario, the Lebanon conflict gets frozen through a separate mechanism. American pressure on the Israeli prime minister becomes severe enough to halt operations in Beirut. Iran sees the Lebanon front quiet down. The Strait of Hormuz question gets resolved through a sequenced deal where both sides make simultaneous moves. The nuclear question gets deferred to a second 60-day round of negotiations. As American officials have been proposing, oil prices drop, shipping routes reopen, the world economy stabilizes. This scenario is possible. It requires the American president to genuinely force his ally to stop operations in Lebanon, which he has not yet been able to do despite explicit requests. The second trajectory, the Lebanon conflict breaks everything. In this scenario, Israel does not stop operating in Lebanon. Hezbollah continues firing rockets into northern Israel. Iran maintains its position that any deal is conditioned on Lebanon quieting down. The American president cannot or will not force a halt to Israeli operations. Negotiations stall. The ceasefire on the Iran-Israel direct front holds technically, but the wider conflict continues at lower intensity through proxies. Yemen continues attacking Red Sea shipping. Lebanese territory continues to be bombed. Iranian resources continue flowing to Hezbollah. 6 weeks from now, Iran makes a calculation. The deal is not coming. Washington cannot deliver what it promised. Better to resume pressure now than wait until the American political calendar makes negotiations even harder. The missiles start again, and this time both sides have already crossed lines they swore they would not cross. Israeli strikes on Iranian energy infrastructure. Iranian ballistic missile salvos targeting Israeli cities. Those precedents are set. The next round escalates from that baseline. Oil passes $110 a barrel. The global recession that economists have been warning about since April begins in earnest. This scenario is not unlikely. It requires no dramatic decision by either side, just continued inertia. The third trajectory, the deal happens but excludes Israel entirely. This is the scenario that analysts in Washington and Tel Aviv are quietly most worried about. The American president stated clearly that the Israeli prime minister would have no choice but to accept whatever deal Washington made with Tehran. He stated that he calls all the shots. What if he means it? What if Washington and Tehran reach a framework agreement? Hormuz opens. Sanctions begin lifting. The nuclear question goes to a second round. Iran stops supporting active military operations against Israel from Lebanese territory as part of the arrangement, and Israel is told, this is what is happening. You did not get a vote. For Iran, this scenario removes the existential threat from the north while leaving the Palestinian question formally unresolved. For Washington, it ends the oil price crisis, reopens global shipping, and lets the president declare a historic foreign policy victory. For Israel, it means accepting a reality where Iran, which spent decades promising to destroy the Israeli state, gets sanctions relief, gets to keep its nuclear knowledge base, and gets to emerge from a war it technically did not lose, while Israel is expected to halt operations in Lebanon under American pressure. The political consequences inside Israeli domestic politics from that outcome are difficult to overstate. The prime minister faces elections later this year. His political survival depends on being seen as strong. Accepting an American brokered deal that Tehran is also accepting looks nothing like strength. This is why the Israeli strikes on Lebanon continued even after direct American pressure to stop. This is why the Israeli prime minister stopped short of using the word ceasefire in his video statement. This is why the gap between Washington and Tel Aviv is wider today than it has been at any point in recent memory. Here is what we know with certainty as of today. The Mashhar petrochemical complex in southwestern Iran was struck, the first direct hit on an Iranian energy facility since the April ceasefire. Oil infrastructure, the kind of target that Iran had warned repeatedly would trigger the harshest possible response. Iranian missiles landed near Israeli population centers. Air defense systems worked, but they are not perfect. They never are. Each round of escalation tests their limits. Iran's airspace returned to normal conditions afterward. Israeli restrictions on schools and workplaces were set to lift the following morning. The immediate crisis stepped back from the edge, but the conditions that created it have not changed. Israel is still striking Lebanon. Iran is still conditioning everything on Lebanon stopping. The strait is still not fully open. The nuclear question is still unresolved. And a deal that 3 senior diplomatic sources described as having regressed is being publicly described by Washington as moving forward quickly. Somebody is not telling the truth, or somebody is negotiating through public statements rather than through actual diplomatic progress. Zoom out one more time. This conflict has now passed 100 days since the April ceasefire. 100 days of fragile truce, 100 days of oil prices above $90, 100 days of the Strait of Hormuz operating under conditions no shipping company considers reliable, 100 days of Lebanon absorbing airstrikes, 100 days of Hezbollah rockets into northern Israel, 100 days of Yemen's Houthi forces targeting Red Sea shipping, 100 days of a ceasefire that has never really been a ceasefire. And now we are at a moment where the entire structure almost collapsed over a single weekend, where the worst direct exchanges between Iran and Israel since April played out in the span of 48 hours, where Iran struck targets in central Israel, western Iran, Tabriz, Isfahan, Tehran's outskirts, and a petrochemical facility in the Southwest, all in one news cycle. The American president said things should move quickly. He is right, but not necessarily in the direction he means. Things can move quickly toward a final agreement that ends this conflict, reopens global shipping, and pulls the Middle East back from the edge. Or things can move quickly toward a resumption of full-scale hostilities that makes the 12-day war of last year look like a prelude. The difference between those two outcomes lives in a single question. Can Washington deliver Israeli restraint in Lebanon? Every other piece of this puzzle is closer to resolution than that one. The Hormuz sequencing question has potential solutions. The nuclear question can be deferred. The money question can be structured creatively. But if Israel keeps striking Lebanon, Iran keeps refusing to finalize any agreement. And if Iran refuses to finalize any agreement, the blockade continues. And if the blockade continues, the global economic pressure escalates. And if the economic pressure escalates, Washington's options narrow to two: military action that would make the spring look small, or accepting a standoff that drags into 2027. Neither option is acceptable, which is why the pressure on the Israeli Prime Minister from Washington is going to intensify dramatically in the coming days. Whether it works is the question that determines the next chapter of this story. Here is what you need to take away from all of this. A social media post did not produce a ceasefire on June 8, 2026. What it produced was a temporary pause dressed up as a ceasefire, a moment where both sides stepped back from an edge they had both approached faster than anyone expected. The underlying dynamics have not changed. The deal is not done. The strait is not open. The nuclear question is not resolved. Lebanon is not quiet. And the American president does not fully control his closest allies' military decisions, no matter how forcefully he states otherwise. What changed on June 8th is that the world got a very clear preview of what failure looks like. Missiles over cities, petrochemical plants on fire, oil prices spiking, air traffic halted, millions of people in shelters. That preview may be enough to accelerate the diplomacy. Fear of what comes next is sometimes the most powerful force at a negotiating table, or it may be just another data point in a conflict that has been running hot and cold for over a year. Watch the Lebanon front. That is the variable that matters most right now. Watch whether Israeli military operations in Beirut slow down or continue. Watch whether Hezbollah fires toward northern Israel. Watch whether Iran's military command issues any follow-up statements adjusting the conditions of their announced pause. And watch the oil price, because the Strait of Hormuz is not just a geopolitical issue, it is an economic timer. And every day it stays under these conditions, the pressure on every government involved increases. Something has to give. The question is what? Tell me what you think in the comments. Can the American president actually force a deal on his closest ally? Can he deliver Israeli restraint in Lebanon when his direct phone calls and public statements have not worked so far? Or is this entire negotiation built on a foundation that cannot hold? A deal that requires three parties to agree when two of them are still exchanging fire? And one more question that nobody in Washington wants to answer directly. If the deal falls through, what happens next? Drop your answer below. Share this with someone who is following the Middle East, because what happens in the next 30 days will reshape the map of that region for a generation. Do not look away from this story. It is not over. It is only beginning.